Okay, so we're recording. So Ron, you don't mind if I record and post this on the website?
No, not at all.
Not, thank you. And everyone else, I'll let you know we're going to post it on the Royal website. This is a stamp talk, so it'll be available to members only. I want to thank everyone for showing up tonight, and I hope you enjoy this talk. I've seen an earlier version of it in the past, and it was like awesome. So I'm really, really looking forward to seeing this. I also want to take a moment to thank Sparks Auctions. They're sponsored our talks, and you can visit their website at sparks-auctions.com and check out their auction. They got a great auction going on now. Please don't bid against the lots that I'm looking for, and I'm not going to tell you because some sucker out there will bid just to run me up. So thanks to Sparks. And I want to thank Ron for volunteering his time today to give us a talk. I sent out a little message, so hopefully you guys all read about him, and we'll get started right away. Over to you, Ron.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot, Joe, for the introduction and for the invitation to talk about Confederate and Union postal correspondence across border to Canada and BNA. I've given versions of this talk in Canada and the US both, but as I add covers and I add additional items, I keep beefing it up. And so we'll try to get through this in the next 45 minutes. And I really appreciate the efforts that they put in to invite people to hear about some of the stuff that I'm interested in. Most of the time, if I show this in the US, they have no idea, a lot of people there, exactly what Canadian stamps are, the area that I cover. I collect the first cents issue, which is also called the decimal issue. And I'm not going to go through these stamps for you guys, but basically, you see the years are 1859 to 1868 when these stamps were being used. It turns out that the American Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865, so 4 years in the middle there. So that's how I happened to stumble upon this particular area of collecting. You're going to see a lot of patriotic envelope designs through this lecture, some coming from Canada to the US and BNA to the US, and some coming from the US to Canada and so on. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of introduction to these Civil War patriotic covers and envelopes, and you can understand why some of them are so rare. First of all, these envelopes were sold in stationery stores. They actually, I'll show you a little bit later, they were actually sold in the field to soldiers of both the Confederacy and the Union. And there's 200 companies were producing these things during the Civil War, and they had over 7,000 designs. A lot of designs were very similar, and sometimes manufacturers would steal each other's designs. But you can see they're usually very patriotic looking themes with flags and eagles and snakes and things like that. If you start looking at how many of these covers are known or how many are around, in 2000 at the Nutmeg auction, Dr. Bischel sold his collection. And in his collection, he had a total of 5,814 Union patriotic covers, but only 176 Confederate covers. So that kind of tells you the popularity of these covers in the two parts of our split nation. Confederacy sort of ran out of paper in about 1863. So they produced covers the first couple years of the war, but after that they had no paper for anything. In fact, if you ever see some of these Confederate covers, they're made out of wallpaper, office literature and things like that. So they had to scrape up paper from whatever source they could get it. How did I get inspired to collect these kind of covers? Well, I read a book, this book here by Ed Richardson. Ed is one of the old-time postal historians of Canadian fame, and he wrote this book in, I think it was in the 60s, that about collecting on the covers. And it gives you a little spattering of each type of cover of patriotic covers and map covers and hotel covers and so on and so forth. And chapter 6 is devoted to U.S. Civil War patriotic covers used in Canada. So that was one inspiration that got me thinking about this area. The other one was I was at a stamp show in New York City in the 90s and the 2000s. Had this stamp show they had once every quarter called the Mega Event. And it was really a big deal. They would have 70, 80 dealers come into New York for that particular show. At the time, I lived in New Jersey, so it was just a matter of a couple hours drive up the freeway to New York and participate in these mega events. And some of the bigger dealers from Canada would come down, people like Art Leggett, Alan Steinhardt, Sergio Sismondo, and others to these. They would have a booth at the stamp show, but what they would come down and do earlier would be to go around all the U.S. dealers and see what they had in the Canadian stock. And so I would show up. They would do that on Thursday, which was Dealers Day. I'd show up on Friday, which is the Patrons Day, you know, and it turns out I'd be going around asking for, you have anything in the early Canada cover area? And they say, yeah, we had one or two, but we sold them to Alan Steinhardt yesterday. So I had to end up going and buying these covers from Canadian dealers, which was okay, but they weren't the cheapest at the time. So if you look at, you have the U.S. covers and the Union covers and the Confederate covers, and you have the Union patriotics, which well outnumber the Confederate patriotics. Unfortunately, I'm going to be talking about patriotic covers to and from Canada, and there's actually zero. I've checked with all the big Confederate dealers, Kimborough and Brian Green and Trish Kaufman. They have never seen one. And I can speculate a little bit why there's no patriotic covers when we get to that section of dealing with the Confederacy. So these patriotic covers, I put 4 examples here on the bottom just to kind of show you, but they had so many different themes. There'd be things from portraits of generals to presidents to military to dogs, soldiers, Lady Liberty, you just name it. And these are kind of a sample of what I'm going to be showing you later on. But on the left-hand side is a typical patriotic cover. You could buy these on eBay, $20 to $35, maybe $40, maybe $100 for a really rare one. So you have to be very careful with buying these patriotic covers because it's pretty easy to take a blank cover like that, doctor it up with a few Canadian stamps, and if you happen to have a hammer, you can simulate one, you kind of cancel it and you know, scribble on some ink and make it look smudgy. So all of a sudden you have a patriotic cover that looks like it's been through the mail. And so you got to be very careful. And a lot of the ones that I suspect may not have been quite right, I would send off to a certification to VGG or to the Philatelic Foundation and so on. During the decimal period that I collect, about half the covers were stampless and the other half were franked. So you're going to see a lot of stampless covers that usually will have either a hammer, you know, pricing on it or something like that. But about half of them are anywhere in the world. I have a lot of foreign covers that are stampless that go to countries that don't have any frank covers going to them. On the lower left-hand side is a cover I'm pretty proud of. I have about 6 covers, United States patriotic covers going to foreign countries. So there's this one here is to Dublin. I have some going to Britain, to Scotland, and I have one going to Switzerland, believe it or not. And those are quite difficult to find. In fact, these covers, I'm lucky if I find one every year, and it's taken me a long time to build up a collection. The very first cover I bought on the lower right was at that mega show, and just as I was leaving the show, I hadn't gotten too many Canadian postal history yet. I went to one dealer and he said, I got this thing that you might be interested in. It's a patriotic cover. And I said, oh, I'm not sure I want to get into that. And he said, yeah, you'll never regret it. And so I bought it and I paid a little bit more than I would ordinarily pay, but I got that cover and that's what kind of got me on this kick. So where did these things come from? Well, I mentioned they were in stationery stores. And how did they get to Canada? Somebody would have to carry them across the border and so on, the blank ones, and fill them out and send them back to the States. And it turns out, you're going to find out there were a lot of people in Canada who are very pro-union. The British and the British Commonwealth had abolished slavery in 1833. So there were a lot of Canadians who were favoring the North in this fight that we got ourselves into. But this is one that's really interesting. This is the box top of a little packet of patriotic envelopes and patriotic sheets of writing paper that would come in a little box. These were mainly for the soldiers, so they'd be, writing home to mama and to their relatives and their girlfriends and stuff. So they would sell these things. You can see on the label there, there's 10 sheets of Union paper. They were usually focused on things like the generals, General Scott and McClellan and so on, and Grant and so on. And you'd get some envelopes, and you'd get a pencil and a pen holder, a pen, and blotting paper. What they didn't put in that kit that I was surprised is they give you all this stuff for writing with ink, but there's no ink. So you wonder how a soldier out in the trenches would get some ink. So that was kind of a missing thing. Maybe they couldn't bottle it correctly or something. I don't know. Anyway, this is kind of the cover of that box, and it's kind of a nice little piece of memorabilia that goes with my collecting interest. So let's kind of look at chronologically what went on that in the Civil War and leading to the Civil War that affected Canada in the British North America. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, Britain abolished slavery throughout the empire in July 1833. So most of the Commonwealth countries didn't have slaves. One of the major things that happened, it actually involved Canada, and I'll just mention a little bit in a minute about that, was John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist who was a very reverent guy, very religious, and he didn't believe in slavery at all. So he became a real rebel and went up to Canada and actually got a lot of Canadians to sign on to his program, which was basically he was going to invade the South, the Confederacy, and all the free slaves that he could get his hands on, including ones living in Canada. He was going to get them armed, and they were going to attack the South and start their own free nation within the Confederacy. Well, that didn't quite work out the way he had planned, but he had a good experience. John Brown actually went out to Kansas that was contemplating becoming a slave state, and through some big arguments and battles and stuff, actually convinced Kansas that they would stay with the Union when they started to split. So the first state to actually leave the Union was South Carolina in 1860, towards the end of the year. But they left the Union before the Confederacy was formed. So there was a certain period of time where they were like a little country without, any government, except maybe their local state government. Of course, the Union never recognized their secession from the Union, but they did anyway. Then a big happening that really caused the U.S. to get involved was when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, which was in South Carolina, and they killed some American boys. So about a week after that, President Lincoln proclaimed a naval blockade of the entire two coasts of the Confederacy. It wasn't called the Confederacy then. That's basically, well, it was called the Confederacy then. But they have a mid-Atlantic or a South Atlantic blockade force, and they had a blockade force on the Gulf of Mexico. So basically, this blockade force was keeping the Confederacy from being able to ship cotton to England, for being able to get merchandise and things coming in, to get arms and armaments. So it was a very successful program, and it went through the whole war. A lot of vessels became blockade runners, so they tried to outrun the Union Navy, and so there's a lot of cases where the Navy captured these blockade ships and confiscated them. Well, about 3 weeks later, a little more than 3 weeks, the postal services between the U.S. and seceding states ended. For a while, the U.S. government was still delivering Confederate mail, so that wasn't going over very well. So basically, that's what happened. In 1861, sometime, Britain declared official neutrality, which really ticked off the U.S. And with that, of course, Canada was declared to be neutral in the U.S. Civil War. Just a couple of things that happened during the war. Emancipation Proclamation is when Abraham Lincoln freed all the slaves, even ones that were still on plantations. They were freed, but of course their owners didn't let them go anywhere. Finally, almost exactly 4 years later, after the firing on Fort Sumter, Lee surrendered to General Grant, who was the chief Union general. Now, this is something that a lot of Canadians don't really know about, that there was a lot of Canadians who actually fought in the Civil War. Believe it or not, over 51,000 Canadians fought in the war. Many of them as mercenaries, but some of them whose families actually owned land in the North, especially, fought on behalf of the Union. And of course, because they were anti-slavery, that was another reason. But still, about 1,500 went to the South to become part of the Confederate Army. Out of the Canadians that served, there were 4 brigadier generals that were commissioned, which is pretty high in the the ranks of military, and 29 Congressional Medal of Honors, which is the highest military honor that any soldier can get. So Canadians really did a lot on behalf of the Union and even the Confederacy on occasion. So this kind of was the U.S. How it is today, but this is how it was then, divided up into these sections. And the lower section there were the states that really seceded quite rapidly. They left before Fort Sumter. Then after Fort Sumter, when Lincoln started getting angry with them, a few more states, North Carolina and Tennessee, joining the Confederacy. Missouri, which is the yellow one on the left, Kentucky, which is the one on the right, Maryland, which is a little tiny one up in the corner here, and Delaware, they were going to go with the Confederacy, but Lincoln talked them into staying with the Union and allowed them to have slaves. So that was kind of like such a good thing he did. But on the other hand, if they would have gotten all the population of those states being on the Confederacy side, it would have put the Union at a disadvantage. And then, of course, all the blue states are states that banned slavery. And a lot of territories, a lot of these states had to become territories in 1861. We still keep the red state for the Republicans and the blue state for the Democrats even today. This is what Canada looked like during this 1860s. Of course, there was no, there were all the separate provinces. You had Newfoundland, you had PEI, you had New Brunswick, you had Nova Scotia, you had Canada East, Canada West, and then you had all this Hudson Bay land, and Russia was still on the continent, is owning Alaska. So it was also different times for Canada. And so each of these other jurisdictions had their own post, as you know, and they had their own stamps and so on and so forth. So this is kind of the introduction, but I want to go through now how I'm sort of dividing up this talk, because what I'm trying to show is pre-Civil War that the mail going both directions, from Canada to the US and from the US to Canada, was basically fine. It was doing well. The United States had a good postal service, delivering mail to all these states. But then the war came along. And I have some patriotic cachets that show a very nice opening for what were the driving forces for the Civil War. And I'll go through those in a minute or two. Then there's a secession period, and that's when the states started to leave. Now, some of the states actually left the Union before the Confederacy started. So those were called independent states. They were states without a country, basically. And then after the war, after the formation of the Confederacy and shutting off the postal system, there was that area, which is the Confederates were actually using the Union postal system to deliver mail. And they said, hey, we're putting a stop to that. They declared all the stamps as invalid. And so the stamps that were sitting in Southern post offices couldn't be used for sending mail to anywhere within the Confederacy or cross-border or anything. So the next step is for mail during the Civil War. So that's the next series I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that area. Mail that went to over the border states. So those are the states that had slavery, but they also stayed with the Union. Then I have a lot of military mail, some with patriotic designs. Then we have a mail going from Canada to the US, and then mail going from the US to Canada. And then I'm really spending some time, because this is the toughest part, was once the war started, the blockade was imposed. It was really tough for the Confederates to get mail to Canada and for Canadians to get mail to the Confederacy. There are some really wild ways that they had to do that, and I'll get into that when I get there. Just a couple other ways that there were communications of newspapers that were had always had a lot of good information about the war, and even today, some of those papers, I have a couple of them that talk about some of the battles going on. There was a lot of news being floated around. And then right at the end, I'll just kind of talk about after the war, about how long it took for the U.S. Postal Service to get back into the South. It took a long time for that to make the smooth mailing again. Now, in my exhibit, I do show this this last part here, and I'm going to skip because I've gotten gold on this exhibit on several different shows I've gone to, including there was a big Confederate show in State College last October. And I've gotten dinged because this area here in the yellow is the area that I think is most interesting for Canadians, because at the end of the war, the Union soldiers were allowed to keep their guns and ammunition and stuff. And so a lot of these Irish people who were still fighting the wars from, the Irish and the English, decided they thought it was a good idea to go into Canada and start a war with Canada and with what's called the Manifest Destiny, take over Canada. But I was told that when I talk about postal communication between the South and North, the stuff that's after the war involving the Fenians didn't fit, so I've taken that out. Okay, so let's look at some covers now. These are just regular mail that was pre-Civil War. I have lots of covers that illustrate going across border. The one on the top is the 10-cent rate, which is the rate going to the U.S. It's the famous Black-Brown concert up there, the 10-center. And then the one below there is a registered mail going to New York. It has the two 5-cent stamps were paying for the postage, and the other 5-cent stamp was paying for the registration. So in Furby's record, Chuck Furby used to keep track of all these different covers and stuff. There's only 8 recorded covers with that particular franking to anywhere in the U.S. Now, this is a cover that I think, and I've been looking around for the first patriotic cover in Canada. And I haven't found any in the Pence era at all. I like patriotic covers, as you kind of guess. And this is one that I actually picked this up last fall in an Eastern auction. It was kind of buried in with a bunch of small queen covers and some telegraph covers and stuff. But everybody missed this. This is a very, very rare cover. I have one that has a 5-cent beaver sent domestically in Canada. Ron Brigham has 2 covers that were sent to the same person within Canada. So there's only 4 or 5 of these covers that exist. And I wrote about this. Ron McGuire and I wrote an article in the BNA's Topics a few years ago about the visit of the young king. This was the Prince Edward Albert, who was eventually become King Edward VII. But I don't want to get into the whole story, but this is the first patriotic cover. These are also very early patriotic covers that were sent to the U.S. at the beginning of the war. It's not quite pre-war. It's like the war started, in the middle of 1861, and these were, sent in September and so on. So, but this shows an ensign flag, which is a flag flown on British ships. And they usually show this flag when they're stopping in a port and things like that. So somebody got the idea that maybe this was a way to show the Union that we're supporting them. And so these are fairly rare covers too. I don't know where any of you have ever seen these before, but I have one more that was sent domestically within Canada, but these are also pretty rare. So now I just want to show, and I'm going to go through some of these rather quickly. What I'm trying to show, you can read these green boxes and not read all the text below there. But so mail to the Confederate states before the war was fairly smoothly flowing. So here you got a cover with a consort on it going to Virginia. You got a wholesale price circular going also to Virginia. It was only a 1 cent rate. Of course, the regular rate, the US was 10 cents. And the rate going to Canada was also 1 cent. Here's one to Georgia. It was sent from the city of Ottawa. I don't know why the Ottawa cancels were scratched out and the 10 put in there. Maybe it was underweight or something. And it was really a double weight cover. It would require 20 cents. North Carolina is the one below here. This is a stampless cover. As I said, there's lots of stampless covers in my exhibit, and you're going to see today. And then the other way around, there's northern states, going to Canada pre-Civil War were, regular post, no problem. Wisconsin, Illinois, circular, the 1 cent circular. You can see the little 1/2 there very faintly. That 1/2 is the 1/2 pence, which in the cents era turned out to be a 1 cent charge for the delivery of a printed circular going from the US to Canada. And then this is another one. It actually has the 1 in there, which is the right hand stamp. Then the same thing with the covers going to the Canada from the US. And so here you have, this is an interesting one here. This was to be sent to Richmond, Canada West. That's a CW. Well, it turns out that the postman read that, the postmaster read that and sent that cover all the way out to California. So you can see this in the pencil there. It says, missent to California. The postmark showed it was sent from Virginia on April the 2nd. And it shows when it came back to Canada, it was May 27th. You can see it went out to California, came back again. The second cover there, as with a lot of covers, a lot of people didn't know the rate to Canada. The rate domestic for United States was 3 cents. And whenever a cover was sent from the United States to Canada and it didn't have the right postage on, 10 cents American, then they would not count the 3 cent stamp. So that the recipient then would have to pay the entire 10 cents, which at the time was also showed as 6 penny 6D. So this is Virginia. Here's a communication from Texas, Galveston, Texas to Canada. Now I want to get into what I'm calling the prelude to the war. And there's a lot of reasons. Most people say, oh, it was just states' rights. Well, that's not entirely true. A lot of the problem was around slavery. The South needed slaves to harvest their cotton, to send it off to the mills in Britain. And so it was pretty cheap labor. They would go over and gather up some Africans, bring them over and sell them in slave outlets, and basically that was it. So the top cover is kind of interesting. It is a very well-known cover to people who collect Civil War patriotics. This was actually owned by Fred Jarrett and Ed Richardson, and It was in the Bishop collection too. But basically, it's a domestic Canada cover, and this is a black Afro-American here, and this man is going to put up or take down a U.S. flag and put up a Confederate flag instead. And he tells him, better not do that. I better put that down, massa. You better not do that, or you're going to get in trouble. So it's kind of a depiction of a slave. A lot of the theme covers are reminiscent of slavery and some of the conditions the slaves were in. This cover here, you think it looks pretty ratty looking cover, but my speculation is this cover was sent from an Underground Railroad station in Illinois, Galena, Illinois, and ended up going, and the cover was actually sent, probably was purchased or given to the slave who was being transported to Canada. Canada accepted slaves as, when they got to Canada, they were considered to be free. So this was let me show this a little bit higher here. This is a bigger blow up of that. So these were Underground Railroad railroad tracks, if you want to call them that, tracks, but of people who were trying to get out of the South, black people who are trying to get out of the South and come to the North. There was an act passed by Congress called the it's called the Slavery Fugitive Act, that the Union had to return slaves to the South. So if a slave was in Pennsylvania, for example, where I live, they basically weren't supposed to be there, and the Pennsylvanian was supposed to turn them back into their owner. And of course, that wasn't a good deal. So a lot of blacks went all the way to Canada. So along some of these cities along the border still today have a fairly high percentage of Afro-American population. But you can kind of see that this cover now was, this is my speculation, Galena was on that railroad, the Underground Railroad, and perhaps the slave picked up that cover. Whoops, the slave picked up that cover in Galena. It was given to him, and then he was transported. These were usually transported in wagons that were covered up with straw and stuff, so that there were slave catchers that used to go into the Union trying to get these slaves, take them back to their owners, because they get paid a premium price if they could get a slave. And so they were chasing these blacks all through the South who were on the Underground Railroad stations and stuff. It was kind of a very organized deal. Anyway, so I speculate the slave took this envelope into Ravenna and then wrote back to one of his protectors, this Mr. John Nagel, who was Justice of the Peace in Galena, maybe thanking him for his rescuing him and for letting him know he's thankful for what he did for this man. But I live right here near Philadelphia, and it's very interesting. If you ever get down this way and you want to do something interesting, about 5 miles from where I live was part of this Underground Railroad. And there were places where they used to hide the blacks as they would only travel during the night. They wouldn't travel during the day. So they would hide during the day, and then they would go by wagon, and the wagons would be covered up, with as I said, with straw or with whatever, bushes or stuff, to try to get by anybody trying to catch these fleeing slaves. And so it's a very interesting trip. It's about a one-day trip, and you take around this area, and they show you some of the places where the slaves hid out. There's a lot of anti-slavery sentiment in Canada. In fact, in Canada West, especially, the Anti-Slavery Society was quite strong. This gentleman here is named William Still, And he's considered to be the father of this Underground Railroad concept. And so he was like the master engineer who put all together all these different tracks for fleeing slaves to get to the North or to Canada. And this is a very special cover. Not only is it a fairly rare cover, it's got the perf 6P perf stamp on it. But the fact is that because it's going to William Still, the local museum in Philadelphia, the Constitution Center, would love to have this cover because they don't have any real envelopes or any covers that have come into William Still. But William Still is prominently featured in the Constitution Hall. So he's a very big hero to a lot of Afro-Americans in this country. This cover here is the cover that I really wanted to get. That John Brown that I mentioned to you was a very key part of the Civil War. He was trying to get together, as I mentioned before, an army of blacks and sympathizers to become part of it. And he set up they're trying to capture the arsenal to get weapons for the blacks at Harper's Ferry. And this was a very famous happening in the U.S. history, but he didn't succeed. They actually they held out for 2 days before they were overwhelmed by the Union Army, and basically they caught Mr. Brown, and they put him up for treason, found him guilty, of course, and he was hung. But this particular cover, just because it was a John Brown cover, was actually sent about a week before he was hung. But the reason why Jim Watt bid against me, I went to the auction where this was being sold, is that he wanted the stamp. He likes to collect perfectly centered stamps, single stamps on a cover, and he got this one out from under me. So I congratulated him for doing that, but I was really disappointed. Okay, what are some of the other reasons why the Civil War happened? Well, first of all, I think I sort of mentioned that England needed that cotton. They call it king cotton for their textile mills. That was the main source that came from the southern states. So this cover here is another stampless cover. The 10 represents the postage going to Massachusetts. So that was another driver. Now, this is a very famous scene that happened very early in the war. Was Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was a personal friend of President Lincoln. And right across from Washington, D.C. is a town called Alexandria, Virginia. Virginia's right across the border from the Washington, D.C. And in that town, there was a Southern sympathizer who pulled down a U.S. flag and put up a Confederate flag. And of course, Ellsworth happened to be there and went up there and pulled down the Confederate flag and put up the Union flag, the American flag once again. And this man there, the sympathizer, shot him. And so he was the first casualty of the Civil War. And so a lot of these covers that are popular are remembering Ellsworth for his heroism. In fact, that he was defending the nation very early in the game. Probably one of the biggest factors in the Civil War was the fact that Abraham Lincoln got elected in the 1860 election in the United States. Turns out that he was anti-slave, and everybody knew what his position was. So once he was elected, 7 states simultaneously left the Union. In fact, in the election in 1860, Lincoln got no electoral votes from the South, from the southern states at all. Our system is a little bit different than your system in Canada, but basically we have an electoral college system that elects the presidents and so on. Anyway, this particular cover was a a campaign cover for Abraham Lincoln and his vice president. And I won't go into what it says, but basically it's some patriotic slogans. Okay, I want to kind of just spend a second here on this table because this kind of shows you all the states that, or most of the states that left the Union. And some of the states left the Union before the Confederacy was actually formed. Confederacy wasn't formed until February 4th, 1861. So states like Alabama and Louisiana and Georgia, they were actually independent states. So for Civil War cover collectors, this is a really hot area because people try to collect all these independent states. The mail was sent. And some of these states, like Louisiana, for example, left the Union on January 26th and joined the Confederacy on February 4th. That was like, 9 days later. So there's only a 9-day period where you can get mail from the independent state period. Now, once the states were admitted to the Confederacy, then of course other states joined later on. So the February 4th was the date. You'll see Arkansas really didn't get admitted until May 18th. So there was that period of time where some of these states and the Confederacy in general was using the U.S. mail system. And as I said before, that wasn't to be had. These covers are so scarce. I've only found in 30 years of looking 2 covers that went to Canada, and I happened to get both of them. I've never seen any since then. The first one is an independent state cover. As I said, South Carolina left in 1860, December 20. And during that period from December 20 to February 4, somebody sent, January 26, somebody sent a letter to Canada West with 1 cent in Washington. That went through the post, no problem. So that was the independent state use to Canada. And then on the other side, Georgia joined the Union on the 4th of February, 1861, but they continued to use the U.S. postal system. So skip to that one. This was sent on February 15th after that period. So this is called a Confederate use of U.S. postal system to British North America. Went to New Brunswick. And the same as before, it's a printed circular with a 1 cent due. So that's pretty special stuff to have those. And I keep looking for them, and people keep looking at mine. Now, how was this mail delivered to all these soldiers that were out in the field? And this is kind of the way back in 1864 or 63, this is how mail was delivered by horse and buggy, of course. And they were very frequent mail service. They put up tents out in the battlefields. This happens to be a tent for the Army of the Potomac headquarters. So that's a fairly fancy tent because that was the headquarters of that particular army within the Union Army. These were just some soldiers. These were officers. So you can see they were nicely dressed. Most of the the forces who fought in the Civil War weren't so nicely dressed. They had uniforms, but then the uniforms were getting torn up and muddy and stuff, and the Confederates were really in bad shape. They had to wear just their farm clothes for the most of the time. But surprisingly, the mail still got through, especially at Union-occupied southern cities. And anywhere that the Union soldiers were fighting, they would be delivering mail several times a day. And I'm really surprised looking at some of the postmarks of coming out of Canada. Some of this mail would take like 4 days to get out into the battlefields. Now it takes 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get a piece of mail from Canada. Okay, so we're going to look at some mail, non-military mail to divided these states that had slaves, but they were still part of the Union. So here's Kentucky. This is interesting that the person who mailed this only put 6 cents worth of stamps on it, but the postage rate from Canada to US was 10 cents. So these were disallowed, and only the recipient had to pay 10 cents. So there was Kentucky, Missouri, another one of those slave states that was a part of the Union. Kansas was a territory, but as I mentioned, Kansas was just admitted to the Union as a slave-free state after John Brown went up there and caused a ruckus. That's why John Brown is very well regarded in U.S. circles. Now, West Virginia, turns out, at the beginning of the Civil War, there was only Virginia. West Virginia wasn't a separate state, but right at about the middle of the war, in fact, in June 1863, the people living in West Virginia that were mostly loyalists to the Union had an election, and they went to Richmond, the capital, and basically said, we're withdrawing from the state. And so West Virginia was formed, carved out of Virginia right in the middle of the war. This is a state where a lot of cases neighbor was fighting neighbor, brother was fighting brother, because you had mixed bag of people who were pro-Confederacy, pro-slavery, and those that weren't in the same town, in the same village. So it was a kind of a bad deal. Kentucky was another one. And this is from one of the territories. Nebraska wasn't even a state at this time. And it turns out that this was sent, if you can read it, maybe it says the Omaha Indian, Nebraska, something like that. About almost 29,000 Native Americans, which you would call First Nation people, or we would call them Indians, served in Union and Confederate armies, which is, it's amazing that many fought, since most of them were treated pretty badly by both the Confederate, by the South and the North during the time when their settlement was going on. So that's a pretty special cover. Now, just as military mail, there are quite a few Canadians, especially doctors. I was surprised that, well, doctors probably were good writers because they were educated, but a lot of this mail I'm going to show you was from Canadian doctors serving in the Union Army. So the first one here was a doctor. This was sent to Washington, D.C. This happened to be this guy wasn't a doctor, but he was a very quite famous after the war, especially a lieutenant colonel for the New Hampshire Volunteers. And he must have gotten promoted or something and moved to Washington because it was scratched out here and it was forwarded to him in, no, the other way around. It was sent to Washington and he was in New Hampshire fighting. They weren't fighting in New Hampshire because there was no war up there, but he was in the New Hampshire Volunteer Guard. This was to a soldier who evidently, you can trace these by looking at the dates, by looking at the battles, you can almost tell which battle this soldier was wounded in, because he was in a hospital in Philadelphia, which was a hospital for neurological disorders. And his military branch was Company H of the 24th Michigan Volunteers. So you know exactly where they were when this happened. So this guy was probably wounded in the Chancellorsville battle. He was sent to this nerve hospital in Philadelphia, PA. This one's to a very famous admiral in Washington. Whoever sent it in Canada didn't realize that these legislative assembly shields weren't valid for postage. So they end up having to pay the 10 cents outright anyway. Now, these are kind of interesting too. Over 15,000 young men from the northern states left for Canada after they were drafted or beforehand in order to avoid being drafted. And I've got 4 letters from these youngsters who wrote home to their parents or their girlfriends and stuff. They were called skedaddlers. And I don't know if you ever heard that word, but I always wonder where it came from. And in this letter, one of these 2 letters here, this soldier who's the same one here, mentioned the skedaddlers were, talked about other skedaddlers besides himself. So that was kind of interesting. But he, the normal things in these letters are talking about missing their friends and their homeland. But they know if they go back to the States, they could be arrested. They could be drafted, but they could be arrested. And in fact, quite a number of them were arrested, and some of them were actually hung as deserters. So 217 out of that 15,000 were actually executed for deserting. And here's two more. Also, this is also another skedaddle reference. So this one of these two letters, the guy said, "Glad I did skedaddle from the war. I live happily and free, and I have my meals 3 times a day and a good bed to sleep on. Money or not, I will stay in Canada." So maybe he still has some relatives living in Dunnville, Upper Canada. What's even kind of cool, there was a sheet music here that I picked up in an antique store. "Can I come home from Canada? Mother, is the battle over?" And it's got some cool words, you know, and music. So it shows you it was a real issue with those 15,000 up in Canada. This is military mail now to the Confederacy. And as I mentioned, these are almost all these letters are going to Union camps in Confederacy territories. So this is going to Tennessee. This is going to Tennessee, the second one here. This one's going to Louisiana. These are all bona fide Union soldiers. And there's very good records on the Civil War one can get their hands on online or even in a lot of libraries. So here's a sailor on one of these blockade squadrons. They were going after these blockade runners. So this USS Pembina, this fellow was from Brantford, I think. Yeah, Brantford, Canada West. And he was on this ship, and they patrolled the Gulf for a while. And even I was able to follow, and the Navy has a lot of publications, follow this vessel around. And this guy Bingham started out like as a lowly, a low coal, not a miner, coal thrower, tosser into the, you know, to keep the engines running. And at the end of the war, he was actually the chief engineer for that particular USS Pembina. That was kind of cool. These are letters from doctors. I could follow these doctors around by getting envelopes or letter covers. This first one was to New Orleans. He wasn't there. This was forwarded to Alabama. Then, Then he went from Alabama to Kentucky. I found another one here. And then he ended up in Indiana. So again, another Canadian surgeon of the 60th Indiana Volunteers traveling with his troops. Another doctor, Dr. Sinclair, serving in the Army of the Cumberland. This is a letter that was sent to him in Clarksville, Tennessee. It was unclaimed. It was advertised. I'm not sure it ever got to him. The next one was sent to the same place, but they realized he was in Kentucky now. So they sent it to Kentucky. And then this is after the war, he decided, I guess, to stay in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and maybe immigrated to the US from Canada. Okay, soldiers' letters were kind of special because soldiers weren't supposed to be charged postage. And so if their letter was countersigned by an officer, then they would be allowed to send the letter with no postage payment. Now, whoever received the letter, though, would have to pay for the post. And this particular case was endorsed. You see this endorsement here on the left under this dog by his commanding officer. It was then sent to Canada West, Welland County. And then it would have been paid for at the US border or into Canada. So here's some other mail now going from the military mail going to Canada or BNA. This is from outside of Chicago. This was from, this is the patriotic cover going from Missouri. Here's one going, this is a military letter going from a camp, from a camp near Virginia to Canada West to Forestville. And this one's going from another camp, Clara in Virginia. So these are all bona fide military soldiers who were from Canada. And so again, stampless and stamped. This also paid the 10-cent rate, the 2 5-cent Watt Jeffersons. More soldiers' letters. These are from the deep South, Mississippi. Big battle was fought in Vicksburg from Virginia. And this one, I couldn't figure out the origin, but it's a patriotic cover. It was endorsed as a soldier's letter, but it wasn't signed by an officer. So not quite sure about that one. Okay, now the next series of covers I'm going to show are patriotic covers. I'm going to go through them pretty fast, just to give you an idea of the wide variety of patriotic covers that were sent. So you can see the different designs, you know, eagles, shields, globes, flags, different kinds of flags. The U.S. changed their flag during the course of the war, from circular to straight lines to stars. Regimental flags, women standing up, standing liberty. This is an interesting one. This is Jefferson Davis standing on a bunch of skulls. This is to the monument to the memory of Jefferson Davis. This is a very rare patriotic cover. It was paid with stamplets. You can see there's 10 cents spelled out right there. This is a simple patriotic cover, just with a flap and some folds being colored. These are campaign covers that qualify as patriotic covers. These are consulate covers in Montreal that classified as patriotic covers. This is a famous cover that was just recent. It was in not recently. It was in 2011. This cover sold for $17,500. Of course, I dropped out pretty early in that one, but it shows Lincoln after he was shot. BNA, there's only 5 covers that exist. I got them all. I've never seen another one from BNA to the U.S. So there's, is that Nova Scotia? Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and I don't have any from PEI, unfortunately. And then these next I'm going to run through pretty fast are covers that were sent to Canada from the U.S. Again, you see some of the same designs. You got the woman riding the eagle with a flag, eagle and flags. Standing soldiers with sabers and flags, guards with flags. Ellsworth, it was a homemade patriotic cover made by somebody, but that's remember Ellsworth. Lincoln was a popular design. This is one that was roughly torn on the right, but still a patriotic cover. A lot of U.S. people like this one because it has 2 different Jeffersons on the same little envelope. One is a olive yellow and one is a red brown. To Canada, but it's on a patriotic cover. It's cool. Covered General McClellan. He was one of the more well-known generals in the Union Army. This one's one embossed. Standing Liberty. Standing Liberty some more. Remember, there were 7,000 designs. I don't have them all. Seems like it. From Kansas, Kansas was just a fresh state to Canada. Smoking cannons with flags, more patriotic stuff. Ships with flags and eagles. Again, that simple line colored patriotic covers. One that's a little bit more colored. This is a battle scene. These are going to, down to Nova Scotia. So here's one that was underpaid. Somebody had to pay for it, though. They must have sent it back, got it updated, because it's also canceled in Boston, 10 cents. Again, these are pretty scruffy covers, but remember, a lot of these covers were carried in knapsacks and who knows where. Nova Scotia, there's one to Prince Edward Island from the U.S., overpaid by 2 cents. The person must have only had 3-cent stamps, so instead of paying 10 cents, he paid 12. New Brunswick, again, a couple examples here. Okay, now I want to focus on this, if I can. I'm going to get through this pretty fast. This is Union. These are covers going from Union-occupied southern cities. You've already seen some of these, but There's one going from Alexandria here, New Orleans. But these are the ones I really want to show. And then I'm just about finished. But this is a cover that was written in Lakeside, Canada West. Somebody carried it. There's no Canadian postmarks on here or stamps, but somebody carried it to New York City, and it was franked with 3 cents. Then it was entered somehow into the Confederate postal system, and it actually got to South Carolina. This is South Carolina, Charleston. So that was one way of getting mail to somebody down in the South. This is a very, very rare blockade cover. This cover I got from Bill Longley a few years ago, and it is a one of 2 recorded blockade covers sent from Canada. This happened to be sent to Georgia, okay, from a brother who was worked in the post office, so used some postal stationery. It was sent by way of Nassau in the Bahamas, and these blockade covers were delivered by these blockade runners, and they all went through the British islands, so Nassau and Bermuda. So this was sent to Charleston, South Carolina. Very rare item. Here's the other one that was a blockade cover sent from Canada. By working kind of backwards, you can see here there's a 12. Well, 10 cents was the postage that you already know about, but the 2 cents went to the captain who was carrying the letter. So here's another 12 cents with 10 plus 2. This was Colonel Lamb, and you could trace back where this left. It left from Halifax. It was in 1864, before the war was over. This was one of the brand new ships that was built in England that could outrun a lot of the blockade Union ships. And that's a pretty good cover too. And then here's a cover from the US, Union occupied South to Canada. This one happened to squeeze through the postal system because it's 4 cents underpaid. This one was underpaid and has a 20 on it for 20 cents postal collect in Toronto. Now, these are blockade mail covers going from the South to Canada via Nassau in this case. So this is one you can see, they don't put any Southern markings on it because they didn't want to call out any attention. But when it arrived in Nassau, it was picked up usually on a port in the Confederacy, taken to Nassau and turned over to one of these blockade runners. Sometimes the blockade runner would take it himself, but this was one that went through Nassau in July 11th, 1863. This is from the same family, from the Irvings. Unfortunately, this is an albino. They didn't have any ink, so it never got struck, but you can blow this thing up and see the postmark here. So again, those are pretty scarce items, blockade mail going from the South to Canada. Now this one was really interesting. During 1864, summertime, there was a big yellow fever epidemic in Bermuda. So for several months, the blockade runners moved their operations to Halifax. And if you know Halifax mail during this time, this is definitely a Halifax receiver mark. This cover was actually mailed to Virginia. So instead of trying to put it through another way to get to Virginia, hand carried or using some service, this went by way of Canada, of Halifax. Here's one that went via the Bahamas. Frank with a 3 cent Washington, didn't cover it, and the postmaster put on there, postage not paid. So when it got to New Brunswick, it would be have to be paid the 10 cent postage for this. This is something quite unique too. It's a flag of truce cover. Now, this is a cover that the operation was like such. You had to take an outer cover and send it to a borderline town, sort of a clearinghouse, mail exchange house. So inside the cover to that exchange house, you had to put a cover that had the right address to go to Canada or some other place. and then pay for it. And the way you paid for it was you would take a stamp, and this is a coin, okay? This is the indentation of a coin. It's not the actual coin. It's a coin that was placed in there, and then a stamp was placed over it to keep it in place. It was glued, sort of glued down. So when this only paid the 3 cents of the coin. So when it got to Canada, they put a 10-cent due on it. So this is what's called a flag of truce cover. It's really a very difficult way to send an envelope within an envelope, and then it had to be inspected. It had to be blessed, and it was put in there, a flag of truce cover on the corner here, and went on its way. Difficult. This one came up on eBay probably a dozen years ago. I spotted this thing was up for $1, and I recognized after a little bit looking at it what it was. It was a prisoner of war cover sent from a Confederate prison. Actually, it was from Roper Hospital Prison in Charleston, South Carolina. And it was sent to Canada, to Prescott. LeBron Harris, it's a U.S. dealer, spotted this thing on eBay also. And I didn't, I figured it for $1. It's not going to go for $1,000 or something. So I put a pretty healthy bid on it. I said, there's nobody that's going to beat me on this one. Nope, I was wrong. LeBron got that cover, and I ended up having to buy it from him. But it's one of four. Galen Harrison, who's the expert on prisoner of war covers, says that he only knew of 3 prisoner of war covers, and that's all he covered in his book. So this is the 4th. Other ways of communicating: newspapers, the greatest source of information. It's really interesting reading. Newspapers coming from the U.S. or from Canada only were a penny, like their printed circular price. There's one from to Dundas. Here's one, a Pontiac, Michigan Pioneer is a newspaper. Again, it was put in the mail in Canada and sent to Montreal. There were patriotic covers within the U.S. that were kind of showing the sentiment with Canada. I'm not going to talk about these so much. This is that first cover I showed you at the very beginning. This was actually used in the U.S. So the cover did get across the border. Somebody franked it and sent it within the U.S. So this is another way of patriotic covers. Okay, and then after the war, as I mentioned, things didn't go so fast. It took a while to start seeing mail showing up. This is a cover in '65. The Lee surrendered to Grant in April 9th, 1865. So it was a long time before the mail started going freely. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, 65. Here's one going in 67, 66 to Virginia, 67 to Virginia, late 65 to West Virginia, Virginia, 66 to Louisiana, and 67 to Texas. Then the other way around, this mail started flowing from the south. Of course, there was no Confederate post offices then, so these were Union post offices that were opened up, and so some of these get to be a little late. This was one in 1868, and 66. So finally, this is where I go on to talking about the Canadian militia and the problems that were going along the border, but I'm going to go ahead and skip that this time and just sort of summarize that the Civil War was a major disruptor to the postal systems, especially the Confederacy. But the blockade mail was very difficult to get cross border. The ships did some of the mail. The flag of truce was another way, hand carried, express services. It took a long time for the Union troops to actually leave the South because a lot of the freed Afro-Americans were being persecuted, and in fact still are today in some places, by the losing Confederacies. And it took a long time. You see, in November 65, only 241 of the old post offices that were run by the Union were opened up. A year later, only 36%. So it took probably 3 or 4 or 5 years for the South to get up and running again in the postal area. So that's it. I'll take any questions if you have some, and I hope I didn't got a little carried away with my postal history there. Sorry to do that, but I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, that's okay. I certainly enjoyed it, I say. Anyone has any questions, just, shoot them in the Q&A and we'll get Ron to answer them. And then after a brief question and answer, we'll open it up and people could talk a lot. So any questions? Oh, all right, there we got a question. Why do you think the Civil War pushed Canada towards Confederation?
Well, one of the things happened was what I left out, and that is the fact that after the war, the soldiers were allowed to keep their weapons. Okay, so there were a lot of Irish Americans who were in the Civil War who fought for the Union, and these guys were by now experienced fighters, experienced soldiers. They started going across. They were called the Fenians from the Irish Fenian days, and they were going across the border, and there were some actually battles fought with Canadian militia. And that whole process of seeing that the Union was so strong now after the war, because they decisively won. Towards 1865, the Union was just killing the South. They could see this, the so-called manifest destiny that was pronounced by President Monroe, 80 years before the Civil War, where the United States was proposing to take over the entire North American continent. So I think the Canadians felt that, hey, we better do something about this. And so with 1867, they formed the Federation, and they had some control over the U.S. The president of the U.S. wanted to have good relations with Canada, so they kind of suppressed the Irish Americans who kept their weapons and wanted to take over Canada. But there was the battles for the first couple years. There were some battles along the border, and people were killed. So I think that was a big motivator in Confederation.
Second question: how long have you been collecting this topic?
I got that first cover in the Mega event in 1991. So about, 30 years? Something like that.
A long time. I
Yeah.
imagine those things are next to impossible to find.
Yeah, the ones that are used in Canada. I didn't really get into it, but Ed Richardson, who wrote that little book that I was talking about, he was able to find 6 covers in his entire collecting life. I've been able to find 57 covers that are patriotic covers used in Canada. Wow. And there's a few more I know. Ron Brigham has one I'd like to get. And a couple of them I passed on because I'm pretty sure they're fake. So there's a few covers that are out there that I wouldn't buy because I don't believe they're real.
Next question: were the postal carriers during the Civil War in danger and shot by someone on either side?
I don't think so. They probably were had guards with them, in their wagon, maybe even accompanied by horseback or something. So I don't think that they were shot.
Just like
I don't know about Confederate. I don't know about the Confederate postmen. A lot of the Confederate post people were, of course, trained by the Union, when they were one nation, and so it was a very interesting mail service in those days.
Of the 51,000 Canadians, would many of them been previous slaves who had escaped and now returning to fight the South?
A very small number. A lot of them were whites, and that was what John Brown was trying to get a hold of. The Canadians were really gung ho for against slavery, abolitionists, and he was trying to get a force of Canadians, whites plus Canadian blacks to, come down and take over the South. And but I don't think of those 50,000 that many of them were blacks. There were black regiments in both the South and the North. I was really ever surprised to hear that the Confederate Army had black, regiments, which you would think they wouldn't want to have that, but they were maybe forced to go to battle against their will.
That's interesting. We have a comment here. I heard many years ago. I heard years ago of a Confederation officials, agents meeting into Toronto at the Queen's Head Hotel. Not sure with Canadian or Union officials, so they could negotiate on neutral ground. Have you ever heard of this, or do you know of any postal history?
There's a book written on that. The Confederate relationship with Canada and the Confederacy was actually in some areas was fairly strong. They plotted in Toronto and in New York City to overthrow the government, and so yeah, it was. There was a meeting in the hotel, several meetings, and I haven't read the book. It's about 800 pages long, but just on the Canadian Confederate relationships, trying to overthrow. They were going to burn down some of the hotels in New York City, and cause a commotion there. So yeah, I know about that.
Here's a comment here that one of your covers from Ravenna, Canada West, was posted on September 2nd, 1864, and the post office was actually opened on June 1st, 64, and was still open in the 80s.
Say that again. Let me write that down so I can look it up.
One of your covers from Ravenna, Canada West, was posted to the U.S. on September 2nd, 1864.
Okay.
That post office opened June 1st, 1864, and it was still open in the 80s.
Wow. Well, I think Ravenna, it sounds like, though, still must have a black population there. A lot of these blacks would get across the border, and then they would just stay there. They wouldn't go further into Canada. They would live in the border towns.
Here's a question. Do you have any cross-border steamboat mail?
I have one going across Lake Champlain, which is right northern part of New York State, and that's about it.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you. That was super interesting. I don't know, finding a cover to PEI from I don't know, just a lot of amazing stuff there. I'm glad you sent me your presentation in case there was a problem, so I'm going to look it over again in the next few days because it's fascinating. So thanks a lot for doing this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the recording and promote everyone up so we can have a little social time. So just give me a second because I have to do that one at a time.